Dear colleagues and friends, I'm really glad and looking forward to today's lecture of Johannes Auenmüller. However, I feel it's quite difficult to continue business as usual when we are so close to the battlefield. There's not much we can do. But I see the obligation to at least to remember. In particular, I would like to put forward the regards of our Egyptological colleague Mykola Tarasenko, who is now in Kiev, and I just talked with him or communicated with him yesterday, and he sends his best regards. And yes, but it's just my personal opinion that I think it's there's nothing new about that, but I think remembering at least is what we can do and what we should do. So sorry for this cruel introduction, but I wouldn't know how to say continue our normal life without that. Now to Johannes Auenmüller, I'm really glad that he is delivering this lecture in the tension between social hierarchies on the one hand, and more specifically the problem of strong asymmetric dependency. I think he will put these aspects in balance. And he is one of the Egyptologists who combines an archaeological approach with a philological approach. He looks at iconography, and so in a way, I think he works on a holistic picture of fragments. I think this is always the compromise we have to do in Egyptology. Johannes is based now in the Museo Egizio in Turin, and he did a lot of field work in Egypt as well as in the Sudan. The title of today's lecture is The Display of Social Relations and Dependency, Case Studies from Pharaonic Egypt. And he will combine aspects of philological analysis here with, again, with iconography, and I guess archaeology may play a role too. And I'm very much interested in the plural of case studies. And I think I don't want to take more time. So Johannes, please go ahead. We are really very much looking forward to your lecture.
Dear Ludwig, many thanks for these very kind words of introduction. And in medias res. Dear ladies and gentlemen, the display of and discourse on social relationships in the context of status and belonging is a key aspect of Pharaonic culture. Both display and discourse were mainly an elite phenomenon, but they also found their expression in non-elite contexts. Social relations and hierarchies are not only thematized in textual sources, they are also discernible in visual sources and find archaeological display in several forms. We will look at 4 interesting cases in terms of tomb iconography, cemeteries, stelae, and settlements today. Those case studies are not meant to treat the topic of social relations and dependency and how those are displayed in an exhaustive manner. They are rather meant to address this topic in different categories of evidence in a way which highlights key points and is also aligned towards a wider and interdisciplinary audience. Ancient Egyptian society is obviously almost unavoidably often conceptualized in the form of a pyramid. This is, however, maybe not the way how Pharaonic society conceptualized itself, but the way in which we use this seemingly fitting geometrical form to make sense of this past society and its structure. Pharaonic society was no doubt rigidly hierarchical, but the social pyramid is, so to say, an ahistorical artifact, as it does not integrate questions of age, gender, social and cultural transformations, etc. It has, however, its positive aspects in that it allows us to understand ancient Egypt as a monarchist state ruled by Pharaoh and consisting of several social milieux, from forced laborers and peasants up to the elite officials and priests. Before we go into medias res, I want to shortly provide you with a brief orientation in space and time. We are in Northeast Africa. Both the Nile Valley corridor and the Delta are the cultural landscapes in which Pharaonic society is set. Upper and Lower Egypt are the two core parts of the state of ancient Egypt. As far as chronology is concerned, I will use case studies from the so-called Old, Middle, and New Kingdoms, thus of the third and second millennia BC. During these periods, Pharaonic Egypt underwent many profound social and cultural transformations, which I won't be able to address today. But the cases I present are thus also embedded in, let's say, different configurations of Pharaonic society. As we will see, they have, however, many things in common in the way how they treat our main issues, so how social relations and dependencies are medialized in the evidence we are going to study today. I also want to briefly comment on the cultural framework into which the display of social relationships is embedded, but only very briefly. The key term here is that of Ma'at, usually translated as truth, justice, and world order. An inner cultural discourse about Ma'at can be traced in the textual record. Ma'at was a social and political guiding principle, so to say. Jan Assmann formulates two key mottos about the application or agency of Ma'at in Pharaonic Egypt. Men cannot live without Ma'at, which refers to the fact that humans as social beings are dependent on community and integration. And men cannot live without the state, which highlights the role of the state and its institutions represented by Pharaoh and his functionaries in implementing Ma'at. Stephen Quirk has also discussed the concept of Ma'at and understands the term simply as the Egyptian idea of what is right. As an example for this kind of discourse in the texts, which in this case does not really use the term Ma'at, but which centers around related concepts, I show here some excerpts from a self-presentation of a high priest from around 1200 BC, so from the Egyptian New Kingdom. He describes himself as an elite member who enacted Ma'at in caring for his fellow citizens, subordinates, and dependents in many ways, as you can read. He thus might serve as a model representing all the other elite members we will encounter today, and also how the elite approach, let's say, this idea of how to medialize social relationships and dependencies, or how these social relations are imagined or imaged then in the iconographical or archaeological record. The first case study concerns the mastaba of tea. So it's one of my older foci of research and its iconographical program. The mastaba of tea, dating from the 5th dynasty of the Old Kingdom, is located at Saqqara, the vast necropolis of the traditional capital city of Pharaonic Egypt, called Memphis, south of modern Cairo. The mastaba is part of a group of elite tombs located at the northwest of the famous step pyramid of King Djoser. Since its discovery by Auguste Mariette in 1860, the mastaba of tea is a tourist highlight, and it has also been called the wonder of Saqqara due to the richness of its decorative program. In contrast to so-called rock-cut tombs, mastabas, as you see an example here, are freestanding structures with overground accessible cult chambers and underground burial compartments. The mastaba of T, you see the plan on the right, consists of the main rectangular structure with a small entrance hall and a large pillared courtyard in the northeast. A corridor which provides access to a smaller dead-end so-called pantry room leads to the main two-pillared chapel in the south. All the walls of the accessible above-ground rooms are decorated with painted relief. You will see examples later. Integrated into the west wall decorations, there are also some so-called false doors, which are ritual devices for the deceased, so those being buried there to receive provisions in the afterlife, and for the surviving relatives, as well as funerary priests and other dependents in the larger sense, to commemorate the dead in prayers and provisions. As an example for the relief decoration of the mastaba of T, I show the north wall of the central cult chapel here. The walls of this chapel are preserved for the most part and contain so-called scenes of daily life. For my paper today, we want to understand those scenes of daily life as highly selective iconographical reflections of the identity, the social environment of the tomb owner, as well as a depiction of the conditions of production of all the goods that were consumed in the funerary cult. These thoughts might need to be specified a bit. The premise of my sociological approach on tomb imagery is that the decoration can be conceptualized or understood as a pictorial map of the social matrix within which the tomb owner, his family, and all other people that are there are socially located. The question thus is, how are Old Kingdom society and its social milieus imagined in tomb iconography, and how are social differences conceptualized by means of textual, compositional, and iconographic features? The population of the mastaba of T can be addressed as a particular social sphere, the household as one core element of identity and belonging. An Egyptian household is generally composed of two parts: a nuclear family, including people linked to the owner by family ties, and an extended family, including servants, clients, subordinates, colleagues, and even friends. Thus, people linked to the patron or to the key figure via personal or economic ties. And all those people appear on the walls of this tomb in the decoration. If we now want to address the social characterization of family and household members depicted in the mastaba of T, so in the whole iconographic program, some numbers are a good starting point, because a full description of the iconography of the tomb would lead us astray from our key question today. All in all, around 1,802 human figures are represented. Considering some missing parts, more or less around 2,000 might originally have been present. Out of these 1,802, 268 people, which make up 15.9%, excluding the members of T's family, are individually identified with occupational titles and names. So they are, let's say, historical people. All other appearing human figures are not individually named or given a title, so they are not individualized and are thus representatives of the respective functional roles or social classes. The representations of T, so the owner of this tomb, which form the reference for all other images around him, take numerical precedence in his tomb. He appears 69 times. His wife and his children, so the core social group, also appear several times, but always together with him. Based on this data, one can create this family tree, which shows that only those two generations, T and his wife and a number of children, appear. T, the owner of the tomb, is always the main person in the iconography, and his wife, sons, and daughter only play secondary roles, and their representation is also always dependent on the presence of their husband or father. So also here, there's already a key social relationship iconographically constructed that centers around the concept of family. A study of the gender ratio reveals that among the 1,802 human figures, 90% are male. The ratio of female figures, including a particular type of women, shown here in the image, which are, however, not to be understood as human, so not really women, but as symbolic, so female-shaped representations of so-called funerary domains, which are the villages and economic bases which produced and provided the resources for all the funerary cults that happened at the mastaba of tea, is around 9%. Excluding all those representations, as well as the frequent depictions of the wife of tea from the equation, only 56 female figures remain, which is around 3.2%. And those, let's say, real women, so those 3.2% women, do then also only appear in very particular scenic contexts as dancers, winnowers, and bakers. And in the lower image here, the blue dots indicate a few male people in the bakery scene, but the rest of those people are female. What we then learn also from that is that tomb imagery, particular this one here in the Tomb of Tea, takes a very specific perspective on gender and draws a strongly selective and labor-divided picture. And the personifications of the funerary estates convey the tea's economic claim to material provision. The selective character of tomb imagery is also underlined by the rarely represented children. Excluding the offspring of the tomb owner, only 6 other children appear. They can be easily identified by their particular iconography and can be found also in only a few scenes. A single naked infant is shown in the context of bread baking. In addition, 2 naked boys appear harvesting flax, and 3 boys, only one is shown here, are tending and driving cattle. And with these very few children, the spread and selective choice of the social tableau of T's larger household, as it is unfolded within the imagery of his tomb, gets visible. The attribution to, or also belonging to a larger occupational group can also be considered, from our perspective of the researcher, as a marker of social characterization. Based on scenes, activities, attributes, and texts, several groups can be defined, which illustrate a wide functional differentiation, which is, however, also very, very male-centered, as we have seen. The people belonging to these groups also constitute the bulk of the whole population of the mastaba of tea. So these people really are the main, let's say, demographic. The huge number of cult officiants, so priests and offering bearers with more than 30%, highlight the fact that tomb imagery puts a strong focus on all the economic resources and the ritual provisions for the funerary cult. The other groups, such as ship's crews, different craftspeople, farmers, stock breeders, butchers, and fishers, and those are only the major groups, are shown to highlight the social and economic status of the tomb owner and demonstrate his access to all those human and material resources and productive forces who work for their patron and master. Next to this larger workforce, 2 other social and functional groups of the tomb's population were important for T in his display of status and patronship. These are his scribes and administrators on the one hand, with at least 149 representatives, and his personal retainers on the other with 74 figures. Since many of those officials and servants are often also given a name and appear several times within the decoration, those numbers do not represent individual people, but the full non-individualized count. T's staff includes an overseer of his estate, some scribes, document keepers, retainers, sealers, manicurists, barbers, overseer of linen, and also dog handlers. Thus, subordinate officials and people that are dependent on such a high elite figure such as T, who had the social status and also the economic means to sustain such a large staff. After this overview of the larger social and functional groups of people depicted, I now want to address different iconographical categories as means of, let's say, social characterization. Size is the primary mode of Egyptian art to ascribe power and status to persons. In the iconographic programs of tombs, the scale of importance is brought to the fore in the stark difference between the tomb owner and all other people that populate those walls. The scale of importance highlights the most important figures and elements in larger registers, and also through the scaled super and subordination of those figures. The scale of importance also brackets the scenes by distinguishing them into the major, so key scenes, and minor scenes to be shown around the tomb owner. Finally, the scale of importance also encodes ownership over the tomb in the clearest iconographical way. So the largest figure means he is the owner of the tomb. Compositional proximity is another relevant category. In the images, the tomb owner is the focal point around which social proximity is encoded via compositional proximity. So one can distinguish a family proximity and also then a functional proximity based on occupation. T's wife and children are always closest to him and touch him or his staff. In the context of the family scenes, the sons of T are shown in their role as descendants and heirs to their father. If register lines are present, the subaltern officials are placed below the tomb owner and next to each other. In the images of music and dance, social proximity is also attributed to the participants through their closeness to T in being represented directly under him in most cases. And the localization under, you see all these register lines, is not always to be understood as actually under him in a, let's say, topographical way, but a way in which Egyptian art uses these registers in two-dimensional space to show what must be seen next to each other in a three-dimensional space. Nevertheless, in this case, also the location of under sometimes, in fact, also encodes social hierarchy and dependency. The body as a social category plays a significant role in current sociological discourse. The body is being understood as a project, but also as a producer of society. Such an approach can be applied for the sociological examination of how the body is imagined in tomb imagery. The opposition pair, let's say formal versus informal or non-marked to marked, can be used to describe the different forms and ways in which the body is represented. The first category, so the cultural elite norm type, includes the representations of the tomb owner and his family and his staff members, and also describes and everyone who, let's say, belongs to a certain social sphere around T. The other category is characterized by an almost infinity variety of poses which capture the wide range of activities occurring in all those subsidiary scenes, so around these larger figures representing T. The iconographical extreme of characterizing a human body is found in a naked and sick worker sinking to the ground due to his heavy papyrus bundle load on his back. The essential point here is, however, not the different poses, but the stark contrast between the two body images. The tomb owner is characterized by the absence of any distinguishing abnormalities, while the worker may be shown as diseased or even deformed. Such blatant deviations from the elite bodily norm in the sense of a physical overmarkedness serve as marks of social rank and professional occupation and show déformation professionnelle. Amongst the workers, there are many individuals with physical deviations or diseases such as umbilical hernia, abdominal distension, and testicle hypertrophy. These diseases are distinctively distributed within marsh workers, fowlers, and fishermen. And these physical markings, which could also be called stigmatizations, use the iconography of diseases to characterize the social status and occupational health of a particular part of the population in the imagery. It becomes clear here that Egyptian art, in this case, has a wealth of iconographic means at its disposal to stigmatize or represent social groups in a stigmatized way. And those groups are then also located at the opposite end of the elite and also of the elite body image, of the beautiful elite body image. The perspective that emerges is then how the elite, represented by T as tomb owner and also as the commissioner of those imagers, classifies those people with all these kind of marks as lower class or lowest class people. The category of habitus is conceptually oriented towards Pierre Bourdieu. Habitus is a generative grammar of patterns of action that functions embedded in the symbolic system of society as a system of internalized patterns that constitute social practice. I try to make use of the concept of habitus insofar as I refer to the different forms, poses, actions, activities of different social groups as social markers. The activities encoded in the bodies, and here also the body is key, can be described as a dichotomy between doing things, movement and hard work on the one side, and rest and leisure on the other. While T and his family embody the latter aspect in almost all cases, all other human figures represented engage in any kind of physical activities of some sort in different intensity scales, which range from, let's say, simply accompanying T in the gesture of reverence, via doing intensive work, but still with a healthy physical constitution, to then also the weak and sick struggling worker that we've already seen. The objects handled by the figures, by all the represented entities, can also be interpreted as social markers. They then can be divided into those that are function related or those that indicate status. The guiding principle behind the sociological significance of this category is as follows. Certain occupational groups use certain objects. And by using these objects, they can be differentiated from others who have or use different or no attributes. And this differentiation can be considered as something that we can interpret in a sociological way. Each activity group, depending on the scene, is then characterized by very group-specific tools and implements. And we thus see the tomb owner in his particular iconography and also with the staff of authority, clearly a status marker, while, for instance, scribes use their professional toolkits and workers their implements and tools and engage with other elements of material culture and of the, let's say, material world around them. The final point to be considered, speaking about die Mastaba of T, is the so-called Ikonographie des körperlichen Nahbereiches. I have not yet really found a proper English translation for that. This refers to all iconographic indices close to the body, such as clothing and hairstyles, as well as jewelry, with which people are marked. The aim of looking at those different elements is to see whether there are features and combinations which have sociological significance. The approach that I have taken, and this is indeed all research I have done almost or more than 10 years ago, was to first, 10 years ago, was to first create a typology of all those iconographical indices. A small selection, you see it here in the center, surrounded by the green line, a small selection of different dress and hairstyles is shown here. Using statistical methods of seriation and correspondence analysis, I have then tried to map out iconographic formations that are characterized by common, so repeated, and thus may be sociological relevant features in an incidence matrix. The clue seems to be here that because each figure in the person type matrix is represented by a combination of several typological indices, so which type of wig, which type of dress, which type of other elements of jewelry or nakedness or whatever are connected with each person, the iconographic grouping of all the 1,802 people appearing in the Mastaba of T could be determined by statistical means. There is no time to discuss the individual typological indices. It is more important to show that indeed distinctive point clouds took shape in the correspondence analysis, in which the specific distribution of the individual types and their mutual factual influence become visible. So there is a relationship. In the upper right quadrant, highlighted here in red, culminate the features by which the funerary domains, so the symbolic representations of the economic basis of the funerary cult, and the wife of T are characterized. So these elite women, so to say, share a certain iconography. The cluster at the bottom right, highlighted in blue, contains the iconographical features of T. There can be no doubt about the sociological and iconographical significance of both these point clusters. The tomb owner on the one hand and his wife and the funerary domains on the other are characterized by exclusive features that cannot be found in other strata of the tomb population. The y-axis marks the dividing line between the high elite iconography on the right and the iconography of the subaltern officials, servants, workers, etc. on the left. Here, their iconographical indices cluster in one larger zone and is also divided in two zones, which one is a zone which contains all those naked and diseased workers, and the other larger cluster clusters around all those many cult officiants and priests which share common iconographical representation. So seriation and correspondence analysis in this case have helped me to address different iconographical equals social formations in the images of T's mastaba. As we have seen, social relationship status and then also hierarchical and social dependencies or economic dependencies are encoded in tomb imagery in many different ways. T, the tomb owner, is at the center of the social space that is unfolded by means of iconography. The social image or the imagination of the individual people, so how they are put into images that extends down from him, includes then the rank of functionaries and servants, because they still belong to the general elite habitus and iconography, basic iconography, formulates then the special habitus and dress of craftspeople and work crews, and then on the lower end marks persons who appear as fowlers and fishermen with physical diseases as a very particular social group. Given the iconographical focus on T and his family, it is furthermore not really surprising that their burial spaces, so including a larger underground structure for T and tomb shaft for his wife and children, are then also to be found within the mastaba. So this is really a key family tomb. The core family is thus encoded in these funerary spaces, their design and also their location. The tombs of all the staff of T, so his scribes, administrators, servants, retainers, are as of yet unknown, but they might be sought in the close vicinity. This was T. Now, for our next case study, we need to jump a bit ahead in time for about 240 years and also to the other, meaning southern end of Egyptian core territory. We find ourselves a bit north of Aswan at the first cataract of the Nile at the rock-cut necropolis of the Gubad el-Hawa. And since I'm speaking in Bonn, I needed also to put the Gubad el-Hawa in here. Here, Tomb Gubad el-Hawa 25, the funerary complex of the high local elite official Mehu, which was built as a joint structure with the tomb of his son Sabni, is in our focus. The tomb lies at the southern end of the uppermost row of rock-cut tombs of the Gubad el-Hawa necropolis. It is reached by a long causeway leading from down the hill up to the open forecourt. At the upper end of the causeway, there is a relief on the southern side. There's a corresponding one also on the north, showing a certain Mehu in the scale of importance and captioned with titles and dressed in high elite attire, being offered incense by a cult official. Here we are not only able to identify the tomb owner, namely Mehu, as someone who receives offerings already, but also another key figure for this case study, namely a funerary priest attached to the tomb and the cult of Mehu. The complex of Mehu consists of a larger columned hall, which is connected to the tomb of his son Sabni in the north. We are, however, want to focus on the tomb that you see here, more towards the left. I forgot to mark it. The walls are not covered with a comprehensive iconographic program, such as the one seen in the Mastaba of Tea. Only a number of key scenes and elements are present in which the type of, let's say, typical iconographical means of social characterization are also employed. But in addition, or this is more or less the main or the bulk of the iconography in this tomb, there are many so-called panels to be found mainly along individual columns in the columned hall. These panels show cult officiants and their families performing and bringing offerings. They remind us of the myriad of cult officiants seen in the Mastaba of Tea, but with the main difference that in these panels, not only the priests are shown, but also their families. Furthermore, these panels were most likely commissioned by those people themselves to inscribe themselves and their family into the space of the funerary chapel and to memorialize or commemorate both their job and their attachment to this space. We see here what Stefan Seidelmeier has aptly called the display of social relationships in a ritual matrix. Because these are funerary priests, the ritual matrix is the founding element that makes these relationships and the dependency of those priests towards the tomb owner, which renders it possible, so to say. Based on all the cult officiants presented in these panels, Karl Joachim Seifried has made an organigram of the funerary priests employed in the cult of Mehu. A hierarchy of priests with an overseer, subordinate inspectors, and further subaltern officials emerges. The role as priest, as as priest at the commemorative cult of Mehu was also passed on from the fathers to their sons, creating a close-knit, multi-generation network of priests which appear in those panels together with their own families. Being colleagues and contemporaries, they formed a tight social and functional group of dependents relying on the allotment of income and duties by their patron Mehu and also of Mehu's son Sabni. But this is another discussion. The close link of those subaltern functionaries employed in the cult of Mehu to their place of work, at the tomb of their master, is not only displayed by means of the panels inside the chapel. So in this case, it's not only iconography. The relationship is also displayed in the form of archaeological evidence. While the many funerary compartments accessible from the cult chapel were reserved for Mehu and members of his family, there are several quite simple tomb shafts in the forecourt which were used for the burials of these cult officiants and possibly for a few members of their families as well. Here we encounter the phenomenon of how close professional relations find their archaeological expression in the immediate proximity of the final resting places of those dependents to the tomb of their master. While then also the social distance between the elite family burials inside the chapel and the ones of the male dependents outside in the courtyard is properly kept. Now we make a 440-year leap ahead in time and move further north to Middle Egypt, landing at Abydos, the sacred site of Osiris, the god of the netherworld, housing his mythological burial place and thus being the location of an annual festival celebrating the death and rebirth and rejuvenation of Osiris. A cultic procession was heading from the temple of Osiris in the city to his mythical tomb at El-Gab in the desert. It passed through a large valley along older royal ritual structures, and the valley ran between so-called northern and middle cemeteries. Those areas were, however, not solely used as cemeteries. They were mainly places in which, during the Middle Kingdom, so-called commemorative or votive chapels were erected. One large so-called votive zone with many such chapels was excavated close to the western enclosure of the Osiris temple. It contains dense brick-built chapels. No underground burial structures are present, so these are not tombs, they are something different. On one larger area further to the west was also explored in the early 1900s. Archive photography of this work shows several stela, we're focusing on the stela now, in situ, and also lying around some of these chapels. And these chapels, which indeed were erected to, let's say, commemorate the participation of their owners or commissionaries at the Osiris festivals, and to mark also the lasting attachment of them, their families, and also dependents, you will see who appears on the stela, to the beneficial powers of all these ritual processions. One of these chapels might also have been the original archaeological context of one of these stela that is now in the Museo Egizio here in Turin that we are going to look at now. It is a prominent example of the so-called family stela of the Middle Kingdom, most likely coming from one of the votive chapels at Abydos. Under the stela linnet filled with offerings sits a larger male on a chair in front of an offering table. The inscriptions in his iconography, so he's larger, he sits, has a particular thing in his hand, identify him as the, let's say, main character of this image and also as the beneficiary of this stela. All other people, characterized as male and female through their different skin complexion, share their crouching pose. So they all share one, let's say, habitus or pose. Based on their identifying captions, the four people sitting in front of Hohernacht can be identified as his parents and two oldest siblings, while the figures in the register below are his paternal and maternal uncles, as well as further three siblings. A family tree with ego in the lower left can be reconstructed here, as you see, showing these two generations. The people appearing in the third register can then be identified as members of a further three-generation family, which seem to be linked with the stela owner by his marriage with the woman called Imeni. She's also represented there. The five male figures in the fourth register are not linked to any of those two families. They are, however, characterized by their occupational titles, so we know something about their jobs. And they also bear names, a fact which allows us to identify them, let's say, as colleagues, so professional colleagues, and maybe also friends of the stela owner, so of Hohernacht, who is the main character. And interestingly, in addition to all those people who are also present in the form of an image, there is a further circle only named in the two lines of inscription below the main stela space. They are, so there's only a text, but the text mentions many people by their title and their name. And they are based on their particular titles as so-called butlers of a number of foodstuff magazines. So there's a butler of the beer pantry, a butler of the fruit pantry, a butler of the bread pantry, of the meat pantry, and so on, identifiable as subordinate functionaries that, since their appearance on the stela, belong to the larger household and economic entity which is headed by the family of the stela owner, Hohernacht. We can also shortly sum this up. The social relations and dependencies encoded on the stela of Hohernacht can thus be characterized as follows. The nuclear family and an extended family constituting the kin group are shown participating in a gathering in honor of their son, sibling, and relative Hohernacht. Some colleagues and friends are also represented as members of an extended social sphere beyond kin and family. Finally, also several subordinates are mentioned as members of the household that are charged with the management of food supply. The stela is clearly hierarchically organized in a descending sequence. Family, personal, and professional relationships in the context of this larger extended social circle are encoded here, let's say, in order to use Stefan Seidelmeyer's terminology, in the ritual matrix of participation at this family gathering. While the whole stela and the imagery aims not only at commemorating Hohernacht and his role in relationship to all the others, but also at displaying the individual, social, and functional relationships of all those people together, as well as their, let's say, ritual attachment to abiders and the location of the stela in one of these chapels. Yeah, so we don't really know where the stela comes from, but since we know other such stela that have provenance from abiders, it is highly likely that this piece also is a votive stela that was set up in one of those commemorative chapels at abiders. We are now, this is the last case study, we now undertake another jump ahead in time, again for about more than 400 years, to a place called Tel El Amarna, a newly founded and short-lived royal residence of the heretic king Akhenaten in Middle Egypt. The city, called Horizon of the Aten, was built on a wide strip of land which was not, let's say, contaminated by any of the older traditional Egyptian gods. So Akhenaten could build a new city for his sun disk god there. It was only occupied for about 14 years, from around 1346 to 1332 BC. It was meant to last for eternity and also embodies the idea of a new royal residence and religious center, including a royal tomb and also elite tombs in the vicinity. While the ritual and political infrastructure and also the buildings, administrative buildings, etc., reflect the new religious and cultural and administrative ideas of the king, the individual suburbs or city districts, as well as the houses, however, they were planned and designed based on long-held ideas and models. All in all, also the number of inhabitants of Amarna is generally estimated between 20,000 and 50,000 people. In the 1980s, Christian Tietze has studied the archaeological evidence of housing at Armana in constructional and architectural terms. Based on his assessment of the data, which includes wall thicknesses and floor spaces and other kind of data, he identified the 4 different main types of houses shown here, from the small 3-room cottage built in close vicinity to other such small houses, to the amazing multi-roomed elite villa sitting inside a vast estate, which not only has or comprises auxiliary buildings, but also storage and supply facilities, and thus acts as a node of collecting and distributing resources. A statistical view of those houses, here broken down into 3 typological classes and also their quantity, put together by Christian Tietze, reveals that about half, so 49.26% of the houses of Armana are small houses. About 30% are mid-sized dwellings, while only 6.7% of the residential buildings belong to the largest category of villas, which in terms of their square meter ground floor space range between 268 and an astonishing 761 square meter. Using the floor space together with their count as statistical data, this histogram by Christian Tietze mirrors the same percentual trend. Here also the owners of the houses, which are known from the inscription and record, are added. The social spectrum of Amarna's inhabitants unfolds from servants living in 15 square meter sheds, via dependent specialists such as artisans and other middle-class people who inhabited the main bulk of the houses, to highest-ranking craftsmen, priests, administrators, viziers, who own only the largest villas in the city, which are then also very few, because the elite is very few and is a very small group. While social stratification is displayed in the type of the houses, so what we have seen here, let's say the type of the house codifies your social position in this larger social setting, then the individual social relationships and dependencies in many ways of the inhabitants of Tel El Amarna are evident in another medium, and this is the city map itself. Unfortunately, the city map of Armana is too large to show it to you completely, but it's a wonderful way of trying to use this kind of data to try to understand how such a plan can inform us about how ancient Egyptian society also saw itself in terms of the architecture and the urban structure. A few examples of city districts or parts already discussed in the literature by the eminent scholar concerning Armana, Barry Kemp, shall suffice to illustrate this point. The slide shows 4 sections of the larger city map. There are a few of the largest villas. They are marked with the red dots, surrounded by their estate. Within these premises, one finds a number of auxiliary buildings, both religious and residential. Then these largest estates are on the one hand surrounded by several larger villas, so second-tier sized villas, which are marked with blue and green dots. And on the other, there are always dense clusters of small cottages and houses in the immediate vicinity of those largest and intermediate estates. While the largest houses were laid out first when the city was newly built, those village-like neighborhoods grew around and next to them. The relationships between the larger houses and the villages and their residents are clearly of a social and economic nature. The highest elite officials are surrounded by higher ranking functionaries and artisans, while the workers, servants, and other dependent clientele lived in the many small house clusters which appear like villages in the vicinity. Looking at these maps is almost like looking at the stela of Hohernacht or the tomb imagery of T, with the difference that the social and functional relations are not encoded in iconography and texts, but in the medium of house architecture and urban planning. But the more I look at them, the more I think, or I have the feeling that what we see in the iconography finds its expression also here in the city map and how houses and neighborhoods are organized. We can also zoom in a little and just have a look at one larger estate around the villa of the Army General Ramose. The main building is in the center, surrounded by courtyards. So also this center location can be read as an image how this social space is constructed. The entrance to the estate is controlled by a guard, magazines, and the scribal office follows. Behind the main house, there is a chapel, a garden, and a well. So elite facilities on the one hand, in terms of garden, well, so water access, and a chapel, which is the religious household or house cult place. The southern strip of the estate contains a further courtyard with different magazines for grain and other resources, which were collected, stored, controlled, and distributed by the elite. So they are also part of the perimeter wall, thus really marking that the control of these resources is in the hand of the elite of General Ramose and his officials, his scribes. 2 smaller auxiliary houses connected with the main house are also found there. Outside of the premise, 3 further houses are attached. And the social relations encoded in this plan might be described as follows. The core is the General Ramose and his family. Extended family members or key service personnel live in the immediate vicinity. The inhabitants of the houses attached to the south also likely had close social and functional ties to Ramose, possibly as relatives, household members, or army personnel. We can't really say for sure in each case because sometimes we don't know who was living in these houses, but the general image that we have corroborates our understanding that these houses, their location, their sizes, their relationships to each other indeed encode social relations and economic ties. Let me now come to the end. In 2010, Wolfram Grajecki has attempted to overcome the pyramid-shaped image, or rather imagination, of Pharaonic society. His approach is less formalistic because it is backed up by the archaeological evidence, both in terms of the funerary and living spheres. Next to the correlation between the clearly hierarchically stratified social milieus of Pharaonic society and individual tomb types and funerary spaces that you see on the left, also the most likely, let's say, demographic dimension of the social spheres is visualized here. And for the correlation in terms of houses, Grajecki uses also Tel El Amarna as an example, connecting the different houses to the different social groups. Whereas Armana displays an urban society through and through, it nevertheless also included people on the same social level as peasants living elsewhere in more rural contexts. My paper today has led us from the idealized idea of a pyramid-shaped conceptualization of Pharaonic society to a more differentiated view in correspondence with the archaeological evidence. The main focus was, however, to address a number of cases in which social relationships and dependencies were portrayed and to show which kind of different entities or actors are there and how they interact with each other and how these social relationships and dependencies are found in many different, let's say, media. So from tomb iconography to stela iconography, to the location of tomb shafts, and even, let's say, a city map such as Armana. Many more cases and also places could be added to the discussion. So I'm thinking of statuary, so statues of families or so-called family monuments, or other objects in which people are shown in relation to each other. But all the other cases and other places that I could add would only corroborate the phenomenon that Pharaonic society is a hierarchically organized entity that puts lots of effort on the display and discourse of social interdependencies, since it understood itself as a pervasive network of social ties which created, constructed, and affirmed power relations that were thought to be the core of human coexistence and of a society based on the Egyptian concept of Ma'at. Thank you for your attention.